Hey everyone, Curse Deck Builder here, making our way to 10,000 decks assisted, and here we are with Ratchet, Field Medic, and this is Eggs value, but also kind of Eggs combo. This deck comes to us from Lexa, who has been so gracious to bring their deck to the front of the queue. Thank you so much, Lexa, for always supporting the channel. And they say they just want a second set of eyes on this deck. I'm very, very happy to do so. But before we get any further, this is a good time to remind you that if you would like a video made of one of your decks, there is a link down in the video description that you can fill out and send it my way. And if you want your deck to be the next video I work on, there's a link for that as well. And of course, the deck list in question for this deck will be in the video description as well, and I highly recommend you go take a look. And just for a few more videos, also in the video description is a link to a game of Commander I played recently at MTG Mudsta's channel. It's a very, very fun game, and if you haven't seen it, I recommend checking it out. All right, so who is Ratchet Field Medic, and why are they the head of our Eggs deck? Well, before we get any further, this is a good time to talk about what Eggs is. Well, Eggs is the colloquial term for a artifact or permanent base deck that benefits from letting those artifacts usually, but sometimes permanents, go into the graveyard and taking them back out. The idea comes from cracking, these artifacts that have self-sacrifice clauses, cracking these eggs and then, second sunrise for your, sunny side up eggs, I think the joke was, to bring them all back and repeat ad nauseum. Now, traditionally, this is a bit of all-in combo kind of style, though Lexa has put this under value, and I'm going to have some opinions on that in a second, but let's go back to our commander and start there. Ratchet Field Medic is a 3-mana mono-white robot, a 2/4 that can be cast on its other side for 1 and a white. We will get to his other side in a second. He's a 2/4 lifelink and says whenever you gain life, you may convert, that's transform, Ratchet. When you do, return target artifact card with mana value less than or equal to the number of the amount of life you gained for this turn from your graveyard to the battlefield tapped. That tapped part is actually pretty important, and we shouldn't forget that because it does turn off certain eggs or certain cards we can use by rendering them tapped, because things like, I think, Mishra's Bauble, they require to be tapped in order to be sacrificed, so something to consider. This is important too, that the limit is with the life, so you can get pretty big things back despite what one might feel. And looking on the back side, we have Ratchet Rescue Ranger, which is only a creature while it's your turn. 1/4 lifelink, and says whenever one or more non-token artifacts you control are put into the graveyard from the battlefield, transform Ratchet. This ability triggers only once each turn. So, what's worth thinking about this? So we have a bit of a loop here, right? We can transform from front side to back side. Goodness, into an ambulance. We can transform into an ambulance really easily, but we can transform back from an ambulance only once. My goodness. I'm sure there's a lot of people who are very nostalgic to Transformers. I'm not really one of them. I grew up watching Beast Wars, but in Canada it was Beasties, a name that is very interesting now. But I don't know, I never really watched these, so it is very, very strange for me to see these cards. But the idea being that we want to flip Ratchet once from robot to, I guess it's robot, what is that? From vehicle to robot, and twice the other way. What does that mean? So it means that our ideal turns are with Ratchet on one side, on the front side, flipping into, so we gain life, and then we flip him, then something goes to the graveyard, we flip him back, we gain life, and we flip back here. It's a little confusing, but it's very, very doable. Something I think I may have said, the flipping is a may, I believe. on one side. So from Ratchet's side, it's a May. I guess they're both Ratchet. My goodness. From the walking robot side, it's a May, but from the driving robot side, it is not a May. You have to do it. So this is a little clunky, but once you get into the groove of it, it's particularly strong because it represents being able to bring back two permanents, two artifacts from your graveyard back onto the battlefield. And then, of course, if you have ways of gaining life on other players' turns and ways of destroying your own or sacrificing your own artifacts, you can do this on opposing turns because, once again, the thing that holds us back from going infinitely is the fact that the ambulance side can only flip once a turn. Now, I'm pretty sure there's other ways we could get around this. The first thing that comes to mind, and I haven't suggested this because I'm not sure the viability of it, but if we ephemerate Ratchet, right? Ratchet leaves, so we start with Ratchet on this side. We do the combo, we flip, we come back, we flip again. So now we're stuck here on the ambulance side. If we ephemerate Ratchet, he comes back on his main side, first of all, so we get to immediately take advantage of it. But we also get to do the whole process again because Ratchet considers itself a new entity. This version of Ratchet has not flipped from ambulance side before, so you can do that again. So, though this is a different build for sure, because I think you would want for sure. Okay, we're going to keep this in mind. We might come back to this, but I think for an even more all-in version, ephemerate effects might be very, very powerful with Ratchet. Unless Convert works in a way that I don't understand, like it has summoning sickness, but that's not on the card, so... And let's see if there's anything here. Oh my goodness. Functions the same way as Transform. Okay, then we should be fine. So, yeah, so if we flicker Ratchet, we could probably go off further. And considering that it also flips Ratchet back to the field medic side, so that gives us 2 more permanents we can bring back as long as we're gaining life, the ceiling is really high with those cards. Okay, I've kind of gotten off track. Let's go back to the deck itself. So, let's talk about the deck a little bit, and let's talk about the concept of value eggs versus combo eggs. And my thought is this. I don't really think value eggs exists or should exist. And I have some reasoning for this. Let's talk about, should before we get to whether it does exist in the first place. You and I and 2 other people sit at a table, and we're all pulling out our decks. And we sit down, we have whatever rule 0 conversation. You say Ratchet comes out. This is eggs, Ratchet eggs, but it's more geared towards value than it is geared towards combo. Now, I don't know exactly what you mean unless you give me the deck list. So I have to assume there is some kind of nebulous space between an all-in combo and, a kind of slow, grindy thing. This is common with a lot of commanders. People show up and they say, here's Brago, but it's not that Brago. Here's this card, but it's not that kind of this. Here's Urza, but it's not that Urza. And I think that's a bad idea because your opponents will always assume your deck is stronger than it actually is. And, they will treat you like you are a much bigger threat. And in this deck, what that means is that Ratchet is going to be removed from the battlefield as often as humanly possible, which can put a big hole in your plans. So that's the should. I recommend that if you're going to play this card, you should go into the glass cannon build because that's the whole point of it. Why stop halfway kind of thing. But then the other thing I have to say is, what is value eggs, right? Let's imagine just generally what that means. So that means that you get to play something like Expedition Map. You use this to tutor a land, probably a good land like Inventor's Fair, and you get it, or later like Iganjo. I knew how to say it, but my brain stopped. You grab these, and then you grab one of those, and then in between those turns, like in between getting them, you use Ratchet to put this back on the battlefield and activate it again. What is the value here? Yes, the value is you've tutored 2 land cards in a deck that has a hard time, in colors that have a hard time tutoring, but you've also paid 5 mana to do so. I don't know if I'm really against that. I think I'm fine if you do that. I'm not going to be mad, so that's fine. Let's take another example. Let's grab Dispeller Capsule. You play Dispeller's Capsule, you crack it, and you destroy someone's Soul Ring, and then you use your commander to put it back on the battlefield, and then later you crack it again and destroy, let's say, Necropotence. What's the value there? Well, for that would be 7 mana total. You have used this ability twice to destroy 2 enchantments or artifacts, or any combination. Once again, I don't really find that too impressive. I think that's just fine, right? Like really what you and I are thinking about when we talk about the eggs thing is that you and I are thinking about using Lotus Petal several times a turn, using a bunch of, eggs to draw cards or gain life in a row, and then using Second Sunrise to bring them all back. That is a strong play, but that's also not a value play, right? That's a play you want to get as deep into and hopefully only have to do once or twice, because after that you've found your combo, which here I think the most reasonable one is Aetherflux Reservoir, immediately gaining life and starting to drain your opponents for 50 at a time, right? And I think, well, damage your opponents for 50 at a time. And I think that's the main goal you should be doing. So on the way to that, I'm just unsure what the value is. Like, even think of a card like Glass Casket, right? You play Glass Casket, you grab my Esper Sentinel, I don't know, I destroy your Glass Casket, and then you use your commander to bring back your Glass Casket and take my Esper Sentinel away again. Is that value? I don't think so, right? It's possible that I'm actually ahead because of the cards I've drawn off of Esper Sentinel and the cards I may have drawn off of Esper Sentinel in between the Glass Caskets. You haven't gone up in cards. You've just actually put a card back in play. I guess you've gone up a card because I have to spend removal on it, but I mean, you have no further advantage with that card. And likewise, somewhere here is Deskro's Reliquary, which works very, very similarly. So once again, I don't really see the value side of this. I see a combo deck that wants to go all in. That's just my opinion on the combo aspect of the deck. And with that in mind, I think let's have a moment to kind of look at some of the cards that I think kind of stand out, no matter which side of the deck you're building into, that kind of stand out at me as being weaker. Book of Exalted Deeds, I get how the first half works, but I think it's notable that you do not have a Mutavault style creature that you can attach the book's trigger to, so you can't lose the game and your opponents can't win the game. Now, land destruction is a lot more common than it is on when Standard was using this card, but it's still a reasonable thing to do that can buy you some time while you assemble your combo. So I would either take the book out entirely, which I might actually think about that, because the second half doesn't even work as it's exiled and not put into the graveyard, but I would also consider maybe putting in a Mutavault so that you can at least get that second half to do something. Likewise, Wedding Ring also feels strangely... I just feel strange to me, right? You get the wedding ring, you marry someone, and I do appreciate that this is in here as I just got married, but so your opponent has a wedding ring. And the way the wedding rings work is they go both ways. So you give the wedding ring to the opponent that's going to draw the most cards, right? Someone's got a Rhystic Study, you give them the wedding ring so you can get those cards on your side too. But remember, they get the wedding ring too. And this deck isn't bad at drawing cards. If we look at like the Mishra's Baubles, if we look at the Spell Bombs, if we look at things like Elsewhere Flask, all of what we traditionally think of as eggs, these cards are going to draw that opponent card, draw them those cards as well, right? The wedding ring is it goes both ways, and I think one of the things like, and I get one of the ideas of this is that you can destroy the ring, and you can then give it to more people, so you're getting all of the card draw of your opponents. I just like to suggest that you're going to be giving them more card draw than that's particularly good, like that you want to. And something even more, like there's one thing to say about, giving every time you draw a card, each of your opponents draw a card is pretty abysmal when you draw the most cards. But even if you say, okay, I'm not going to do that, I'm just going to pick the opponent with the most card draw and benefit from it. The thing it also does is you're giving your opponent with the most card draw more card draw. Card draw is one of those things that, yes, it does have diminishing returns. Like the difference between drawing 30 cards and 40 cards is not that different, but drawing those first 20 cards is really important. But I don't think, unless your opponent is using something really ridiculous, they're drawing 30 cards, right? Most likely they're drawing 3 or 4 a cycle, and then if you're giving them 2 to 3 more a cycle, that's a huge boon on their side. It's a huge boon on yours as well, but like you're kind of making yourself an arch nemesis when you do this, which feels like the opposite idea of the wedding ring. So I don't particularly like that. Let's see. Throne of Eldraine also seems kind of strange. This was a card that just got printed recently that I just keep looking at. I do get the idea of its strengths, but it really doesn't feel that strong. It feels really, really clunky. Like the idea is that you use it in a monocolored deck. I get that. So we're in mono white. We have Throne of Eldraine. So we can get 4 mana of the chosen color that we can spend on white spells. Well, interestingly enough, a lot of your deck isn't white, right? So there's a lot of cards you actually cannot cast with this. So already, I don't like that first half. And then the second half says, for 3 mana, draw 2 cards, spend only mana of the chosen color to activate that ability. So your mana rocks are kind of clunky here. Like you can't use your Mind Stones, anything that makes... I don't know why the picture won't show me Mind Stone. Interesting. Okay, there we go. The Mind Stones and other colorless mana production will not actually work on this, so that's something worth considering. And things like, let's see, if we're playing Guild Globe, this is kind of funny. Guild Globe won't work either because you have to add 2 mana of different colors. So let's say you add black-white. You can only sink the white into here. So not the biggest problem, but something worth considering. And so 3 mana to cast Divination, basically. So, sorry, I'm going to harp on this card a little further. So it's not 3 mana repeatable Divination, right? It's 8 mana for the first Divination, and then it is 11 mana for the second Divination, and then for the third Divination, that would be 13 mana. No, sorry, 14 mana. If you told me you use 14 mana to cast Divination 3 times, I don't know if I agree with that. I don't think that's an ideal thing. If you can tap, untap it. Do we have Galactic Key in here? I feel like we should if we don't, but we do not. Like, if you keep tapping it and untapping it, using it over and over again, perhaps I'm more forgiving of Throne of Eldraine, but it's so much mana to do anything. And the real powerful side is that first part, adding 4 mana. Like, a 5 mana rock that adds 4 mana is really, really strong, but you can't even use it to its full ability. So I don't know to what degree that I like that, right? Something that's even worth considering is that you can't use this on abilities, right? So you can't use this for Urza Saga, you can't use to crack maps, you could only use it on white spells. So there's a very hard limit on this card. And yeah, it's great when you pull out the book because that uses 3 of it, but it doesn't even use the 4th. So you have to be casting Wedding Ring or something like that. It's funny that the cards I want to remove are all castable with this. So overall, Throne of Eldraine feels like an incredibly weak card. And to be fair, I don't think that's unique to this deck. I think this card is rather weak in general. The only place I would see this being really good in my mind is monocolored decks that are very, very card hungry and very, very spell hungry. And by that I mean like group slug in red or like burn in red, where they constantly need to be casting spells and constantly need to be drawing new spells, or mill in blue, or discard in black. But discard and mill and even group slug, all of them kind of tend to use enchantments instead of one-off uses. So maybe a monocolor spell slinger style deck would use this, but this is not that. So I don't particularly like it here. Going around a bit further, I'm looking at Angel of Ruins. I get the idea here. I guess I won't complain too much about it. I think it's fine. With the plane cycling, it's fine. I don't, even with the reanimation, 7 life, you have to gain 7 life to reanimate the angel, which is a lot. It's very doable, but it is a lot. So by the time the angel is coming out, it's probably later in the game where you could have just cast the angel. Whereas something that's really good about the Angel of Ruins is that you try to discard it really, really early and then immediately reanimate it on like one of the first few turns, so that you get it right away. And then a 5/7 that exiles like 2 mana rocks is really, really strong. But on turn like 6, turn 7, when you could have actually just cast the angel, it gets a little worse. So I don't know to what degree I particularly love that. But I wouldn't fight you too much on it. Likewise, Metalwork Colossus, I feel like it's only here for the sacrifice 2 artifacts ability from the graveyard, and I don't disagree with that. I wish we had more ways to throw it into the graveyard from our hand, but I guess it's reasonable to cast with enough artifacts. I don't particularly like it, but I do understand it's a combo piece down here, so I'm once again not going to complain too much. Cataclysmic Gearhulk. This is a card that I am generally suspicious of outside of very, very certain decks. And the reason is, I just don't think it gets the results you want a lot of the time, right? So Cataclysmic Gearhawk, first of all, I really like it in non-artifact decks, which feels weird because it's an artifact creature, but the benefit of it in a non-artifact deck is you play this and you name it as your artifact, and you name your commander or another creature as your creature, so you get to keep both. However, in artifact deck, you actually don't get that leeway. You lose all your other artifacts. You're forced to name your commander as your creature, but since they're an artifact creature too, we can flip them around either way. But you know, I don't know if that's the best plan. You've got some other creatures that you want to keep, and you know, you could just lose the Cataclysmic Gearhulk, but then why not just play Cataclysm? I know it puts you down on lands, but you do play Second Sunrise and things like that. So I don't see why not just to play the OG more powerful. Maybe it's $1 million. How do you spell Cataclysm? 4 mana. Oh no, it's a few dollars. Okay, that's not so bad. So maybe actually just play the original if you want that ability, because I just don't see it here. I think it's too clunky. You have too many artifacts, the math's too bad. And then, even then, I don't like this card, specifically this card. Cataclysm is something else, but this card over Tragic Arrogance. Tragic Arrogance is just much, much stronger because you make the decisions for your opponents. There's just a lot of times you'll cast the Gearhulk and the board will not change that much. Don't get me wrong, this is pretty good against people who go wide and tribal decks, but outside of that, there's a lot of mid-range opponents, which are going to be your biggest problem, are basically going to ignore this. They're going to look down, pick their best mana rock. They're going to pick their best enchantment, which could be like card draw or mana generation. They'll pick their commander, and that's it. They're good, right? They're not going to be too upset otherwise. And I think that's kind of a problem. So I don't like it at this mana cost. I don't like that it's not just a board clear. I would rather Tragic Arrogance or just cut it entirely. Let's see. Hope of Ghirapur feels cute. I'm not gonna say, like, this is one of the only decks that it'll work repeatedly, so I'm not gonna say necessarily cut it. I just don't think it's going to be as good as you think it is, because non-creature decks tend to be running a lot of instants. So what they'll do is they'll just hold their mana. Like you use this against Spellslinger or any combo deck, and they'll wait until your next turn in between attacks to cast their spells. Granted, this works really well with decks like this, like the deck you're playing, where it completely shuts them down, and we'll get to that in a second. But otherwise, I think it is just a little weak, so kind of rings a little false to me. Okay, I think that's generally it. A lot of the other cards are like the core of the combo, and I'm going to suggest a lot more cards than I cut. But, you know, for a lot of these cards, like Basilica Skullbomb is like the third spell bomb, at least, right? Origin Spellbomb and Sunbeam Spellbomb, and then finally Basilica Spellbomb as the weakest one of the group. So we have a lot of redundancy, but it also means our cuts will probably, after our first initial cuts, will come from the redundant parts of the deck. So I'm going to leave that part for you to kind of go through. And let's go into additions. Actually, before we go into additions, because it will come up in my additions, we do have to talk about the vulnerability of this deck. This is another problem with playing this as a value deck as opposed to an all-in deck, is that even if when you play it as a value deck, you're still vulnerable to all of the same hate. So for example, cards like Rest in Peace, cards like Stony Silence, these cards completely destroy this deck. Maybe Stony Silence is not always as strong, but it's still really, really strong. But especially Rest in Peace, especially cards like Thalia that prevent you from casting spells at a good rate. Cards that like Rule of Law that shut down the number of spells you can cast. Anything like that. Things that are just general artifact hate will be just very, very strong against you. And it's mostly Graveyard Hate, I think, is your strongest enemy, because Graveyard Hate just effortlessly defeats your deck. One Rest in Peace kind of shuts down the entire deck. And at the current setup, you have very, very few ways of actually dealing with it. I believe Dispeller Capsule is kind of the only one. I could be missing another one, but it's one of the only ones, and that's not ideal. Also, I think something that's worth noting, and this is something I notice a lot, I've done this too, but when we build a theme deck, we tend to make our interaction on theme. So Dispeller's Capsule can get rid of Stony Silence, but it can't, right? Like, Dispeller's Capsule is your main way of getting rid of Stony Silence, and it cannot do that under Stony Silence, which is really, really funny. So, though Dispeller's Capsule is really, really good, I think I would just prefer Disenchant, which is, I'll suggest that when we get to it. Because, you know, if you're playing against an opponent who at a higher level is tutoring for cards, or at a mid-level is drawing a lot of cards, if they happen to get any form of incidental artifact hate, any form of graveyard hate, they're going to prioritize playing that. They're gonna play that against you and get really, really far ahead with it, right? One Rest in Peace completely shuts you down, but something like Lion's Sash, also that card is not showing up, Lion's Sash, or Scooze, Scavenging Ooze, anything like that, anything that allows them to start like draining people's graveyards, any form of Bajuka Bog, anything like that, is going to be targeting you, and it's going to be so detrimental for your game plan, and that's really tough to get around. So for me, it's like, you know, you can sit down and be the value player and say you're the value player, but everyone's going to treat you as a combo player, and their hate, whether they mean to it or not, will treat you as a combo player. They might believe you and say, oh no, you're right, I believe that you aren't a all-in combo player, but they might still play Rest in Peace to deal with something else, or just because it's a good play, and that Rest in Peace doesn't care that you're a value player. That Rest in Peace is there to completely shut down your deck. All right, let's look at additions. A few cards here and there that I think piqued my interest, and a few cards that I think definitely need to be in there. Leonin Elder is really interesting to me. I do like it as just very, very clean, you know, life gain. I think that first life is really, really important because it hits a lot of the cards that are very good in your deck, like a very substantial amount of cards here. I haven't even looked at the curve because I knew it would look like this. Like, the curve is very nice. We don't need to worry about it. but this entire section of artifacts can be returned by one artifact coming into play. And this is your opponent's as well, right? And I think that's rather good and rather worth considering. It also is a really nice life buffer because depending at the power level, your opponents might just try to attack, like aggro you out, especially if you're playing against, some kind of tribal deck or some kind of combat deck. They tend to have less methods of dealing with a combo like yours, so they'll probably just put the pressure on. And Leonin Elder, I think, reasonably will gain you upwards of 10 to 20 life a game if it sticks, and I think that's very, very strong here. So I think this is definitely on the list of things I think you should play. Foundry Inspector is also noticeably missing. This is a card that's just generally good in the type of deck that you're running. It's also soft rebuttal to Thalia, just putting you back to neutral. But when Foundry Inspector is out and not interacted with, you can get particularly far. There's a few other versions of this card. I think there's one that's an owl. I think it's like Joyra's something. That makes historic spells cost one less. You can do that as well. I think just the first one of these spells is probably going to be the best, and Foundry Inspector is the best one for you. So I would at least play this and then maybe consider another one. So these two from the start, I think, are the strongest additions you could probably have to improve your game. And especially with Foundry Inspector, remember that you're not always going to have your commander out, and just playing through your artifacts normally, Foundry Inspector will be there to help you do that. Speaking of things that work when your commander is not out in play, Recommission and Refurbish are definitely cards that I think are worth considering. Recommission first because it's lower mana and the majority of your cards are 3 mana or less, but Refurbish is also there to bring back any artifact. So I'm thinking things like your Wormcoil Engine, your Angel of the Ruins, Venser's Journal, Batterskull, these kind of things. You'll be a lot happier. Aetherflux Reservoir is definitely the big one, I think, that Refurbish hits, that Recommission doesn't. But both of these cards, they kind of fill in the void that if your commander's not out and your commander's not functioning, it's been hated out of the game, being able to just have these reanimation spells to pull your artifacts out when they haven't been put in that turn. Like, this is Faith's Reward and Second Sunrise are combo cards. They only work the turn of. Whereas Refurbish, if you draw it on a separate turn that you lost your reservoir, you still get it back. So I do like those as well. Then, something that I think is notably missing, you are a graveyard deck, but you don't have a lot of ways to put those cards into your graveyard. And I would like you to be able to do that. So, and in mono white, we don't have a lot of good answers. So I'm going to show you, what order am I going to show? I have 3 here. Let's go backwards from the weakest and safest one to the strongest and craziest one. So the weakest and safest one is just a Ghoul Caller Bell kind of card, a card that's easy to recur from your graveyard, that just constantly, turn after turn, just puts a card into everyone's graveyard. It's really safe. You're not going to lose any, you might lose a few cards here and there that you want, but you're likely just to hit more artifacts to pull out. There's some soft kind of, frustration on your opponent's side as they lose cards. I really don't recommend this one, but if you want this ability and you want to be really, really safe with it, Ghoul Caller's Bell is probably the safest one. Now, the one that's stronger and the one that I'll probably suggest is Altar of Dementia. Altar of Dementia is particularly good, especially with a few cards such as Metalwork Colossus, where you can mill 10 with it, reanimate it, put it back into your hand, play it again, mill 10 with it. And traditionally you'll be milling yourself with this ability, but there are situations where you can mill your opponents, especially with the Colossus, because milling 10 per activation is really, really good. But the main reason I do like this is we can use this to sacrifice some of our creatures, such as Filigree Familiar. Scrap Trawler, I haven't talked about Scalp Trawler because I think it's just apparent how good this card is. But obviously a lot of things that I will say will combo with that. But I'm thinking of these Filigree Familiars, these Circuit Mender style cards, which you want to sacrifice into your graveyard. I wouldn't mind, you have Ravager, you have Oswald, I wouldn't mind a few other ways to kind of sacrifice them easily. And Altar of Dementia, because they're creatures, is a really, really good way of doing that. You can sacrifice these creatures, fill up your graveyard, and then use a life trigger to get the cards back. So I do particularly like Altar of Dementia. I would say play this the most. But if you want to be a little spicy and a little more aggressive, Mesmeric Orb also will do this job. Once again, it is an artifact, which means we can pull it out of our graveyard, and it is particularly good at self-mill. Generally, we're not going to worry too much about milling out our opponents. We're just going to play this to mill like turn after turn. It's kind of be exponential where, first we have 3, then we have 4, then we have 7. Maybe that's not exponential. Incremental, let's say. And so with this, we're going to be able to mill more and more of our decks into our graveyards. And when we do that, we'll have more and more answers. Now, is this ever going to be useful against our opponents? I mean, it's possible, right? Like, there's situations where someone might cast an infinite amount of tap tokens, and you can play Mesmeric Orb, and then when they untap, they lose all of that. That's possible. I don't think it's likely. You can have an opponent that has, like, I don't know, 20 1/1 creatures, and then they have to wait 5 turns. Well, let's be more realistic. 4 turns to mill out completely. That's not going to happen. They have 21 1s. They're probably winning the game. So I don't see that either. And even the best case scenario I can imagine where you get the most out of this is like an opponent who's fetched all of their lands into play or something, and they're looking at like 3 turns before they mill themselves out. But even that's not realistic because land decks tend to really appreciate their graveyards being filled because they tend to have a lot of cards that pull lands out of their graveyards. So all in all, I think you just kind of ignore the fact that Mesmeric Orb hits anyone but you, and just kind of move on, honestly, and just use this as a self-mill thing. So this is kind of wild because you have very little control over it, but it does mill the most. But as I said before, I think Altar of Dementia would probably be the best bet. All right, finally, actually not finally, I have 2 more sections. Let's talk about interaction. So these are going to be kind of straightforward. I just want you to be able to interact more with the hate pieces that your opponents might purposely or incidentally have against you. Path to Exile, I just feel like I would like you to have a secondary, direct creature removal. We have a lot of things that can pull out small creatures. So I'm thinking like Thalia's, I'm thinking about Kami of the... I can't remember what the white Kami that makes all your artifacts cost 1 more. But I think overall, at the same time, being able to hit something bigger that might be just as hateful against you. I can't really think of anything in mind, but I just wouldn't mind having 1 more of these effects. You are in white. Path to Exile is one of the strongest cards that you have access to at 1 mana to completely exile, a permanent, a creature, sorry. And I hear so much hate for this card. I really don't understand it. I think people genuinely think that either 1, their opponents have been stuck on, they just needed that 1 extra land, and you path their creature and they're like, now I can win. And I just don't think that's real. Most of the time with Path to Exile, you're taking out key cards. You're taking out the cards they would have rammed into, or you're taking out a card that's just a lot of mana to begin with. Like, someone casting a 7 mana creature that threatens the game and you path to exile them, that 8th land is not going to make a big difference, right? It is the power of just being able to exile something permanently. For what it's worth, at 33 lands, you might path your own creatures. I find that line very suspect as a form of kind of argument for it, but Path to Exile is a phenomenal card. You are in white. You should definitely be playing those cards. Obviously, Swords to Plowshares is stronger in my opinion, but there's no reason to be not playing both, if you ask me. All right, let's look at some non-creature removal. Fragmentize will destroy artifacts or enchantments with converted mana 4 or less. I think that's generally good enough, if you ask me. But it is sorcery speed. It's 1 mana, but it is sorcery speed. And then Disenchant here at 2 mana. This is notable that I haven't said Generous Gift or Midnight Stroke of Midnight, and that's just because I don't like your mana is kind of tight actually, and I really like the idea of keeping yourself, you know, on a low curve as much as we can with a deck like this. But if you wanted to just kind of get around all of this and say, hey, forget about it, I'm just gonna problem solve, Generous Gift will be there for you. And I would actually really recommend Generous Gift over Stroke of Midnight because I've misspelled it because of, oh, that's not what it's called. Let's see. Exile, Graveyard, Desert. Scavenger Grounds, yeah. So because of cards like Scavenger Grounds, which I do see more often than you would think, this is a card I do respect. It's not Bojuka Bog. You can't get around Bojuka Bog, but Scavenger Grounds can be tapped for mana, and then you can Generous Gift it, because otherwise they're going to hold it up on your like really strong turns and knock you out of the game. So being able to take out a card like this is very relevant. So I do actually recommend using the Generous Gift over the Stroke of Midnight. Finally, the last one on the list is a bit of a bit of a meme here, in the sense that it has the same problem as Dispeller Capsule, that this is really good, but also really bad against things like Stony Silence, Collector Oof, things like that. But this does have the greatest kind of net that it can throw. This can answer almost... Actually, we're in monocolor. No, we have a lot of ways to make other colors. This is really good. We can use this to create specific bombs to take out specific situations, or throw it on 0 to stop the token player. I think this is fine. The fact that you can recur it is really, really good. I think this is just good in the deck, and the fact that it's incidentally good against certain cards is going to be great, but I wouldn't rely on this as your way to destroy permanents that interact with you. All right, I have 2 last cards to add. I think they are notable because I want you to have kind of a second plan. And though we have pieces of a second plan here, I'd like to add to it, and it is specifically those construct tokens. Construct tokens are the 0/0 artifact creature tokens that grow with each artifact you have. And in a deck like this, they can be rather big rather easily. Now, Digsite Engineer is a bit of a mana sink because it costs 2 mana every time to activate whenever you cast a spell. But with your number of low mana cards, I think later in the game, this is going to be particularly good. And especially at points where you feel, how do I put this? You feel like you can invest into these golems early game. Like you take a turn off just to play 1 card or 2 cards and trigger this, like activate this like once or twice. Can probably get you really far ahead, because on really strong turns, you can probably get those constructs to like 7s or 8s and get some good attacks in, and then you can kind of flip certain situations with that. And late game, I think just putting all of your mana into making an army of these is particularly good. Now, this one is the clunkiest one. Granted, it's the same cost of how Urza Saga puts out construct tokens, but you have to cast another spell. Obviously, with a 0 mana spell, this gets a lot better, but it's worth considering. The one that's also good here, I think, is Karn, Scion of Urza, where you just play them and then -2 twice. 4 mana to be able to use this ability twice is exactly on curve, or like at cost for this ability. So I do particularly like it. And then you get to keep it and you can start +1ing. The +1 and -1 are a little suspect. They're just okay, but you're really just playing this for that last ability. I think in certain situations you'll be happy to +1, but it's a bit clunky. I think honestly, this card that just generates these construct artifact tokens, you're going to be really happy to get 1 or 2 out. They'll block for him. They'll do pretty well. And those are my suggestions. Overall, I think the deck is really fun. I think there's some limitations of the deck that we can't get around. Ratchet being monocolored does put a bit of a damper on a lot of the things you can do in an eggshell, but Ratchet is also really strong, like noticeably very strong. It's hard to actually gauge how strong it is until you see it in play. But when you talk about a commander that enables you to return 2 artifacts from the graveyard to play a turn, that's really, really good. And your opponents, once they figure it out, are going to be very, very keen on destroying your commander. So you need to be a little prepared for that. And this is partially why I think maybe going into an all-in glass cannon build is better, because if you're fighting uphill the whole time and your opponents are treating you as like the fire that needs to be extinguished, you're probably, probably the best bet is to validate that opinion and go for it, as opposed to try to hide behind, you don't have any politics in your deck that you can kind of divert attention. Your deck is very much so threatening something very strong at all times, and your opponents are probably going to treat you as that. So there's only so much you can do, and I think maybe kind of upping the ante a little bit would be a good idea. I think that's generally what I have to say. I am interested to see another draft of this, because this seems to be a really interesting deck. I'm trying to imagine how well it plays. These kind of decks that go through their like card draw or value through their entire deck are really hard for me to gauge. I've played a few of them, from Anya to 4-mana Joyra that draws you a card every time you play an artifact. And I'm always a little off kilter on how good or bad they can be. But looking at this, we have a lot of really good pieces. We have a lot of good combos. I think it's possible to be very, very strong. And I think it's best to lean into that. All right, if you have another draft of this deck, or any deck you'd like to send my way, there is a link in the video description down below. And if you would like that deck to be the next one I work on, there's a link down there too. Finally, if you could like, comment, subscribe, do the whole YouTube thing, I would be very, very grateful. Once again, thank you, Lexa, for supporting the channel. It is always a pleasure to work on your decks. They're always a lot of fun, and I hope this video was helpful to you, and good luck. Oh, also like, comment, subscribe. Do that.